but it'll be pretty good. And so that leads us to tonight. I'd like to have Professor Steph from the law school here and ask the 5 questions. Pre-warned Steph that these were coming.
Okay.
Steph, where were you born?
I was born in Phoenix, Arizona.
And where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at a school in Cordova, Tennessee that now no longer exists. It's a suburb of Memphis.
Okay. And then where'd you go for your undergrad?
I went to Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
And what'd you study there?
I studied chemistry.
It's a mystery, chemistry. I don't know why they don't spell it that way. And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees? Law?
Well, first I got a PhD in atmospheric chemistry at Tufts University, and then
you stayed in Boston.
I stayed in Boston. Then I went to DC and got my law degree from Georgetown.
And then when did you come here?
I came here in 2006.
Wow. Excellent.
So been here for a while now.
That's good. So tonight you get to talk with us about in fairness to future generations of eaters and drinkers, how legal reforms can protect our culinary heritage. Would you please join me in welcoming Steph to Wednesday Night Lab?
Thank you for having me here, Tom.
Thanks for coming.
Honored to be here to talk about this topic that is near and dear to me, and near and dear to many people, right? Food and drink are an important part of our cultural heritage. Many sociologists have observed the role that food and drink has played, both in forming relationships in different cultures, in marking the passage of time, in integrating people's lives together. They are, in some ways, intertwined with our identities as people, different foods and drinks. And usually these are long-term kind of foods and drinks that have been passed from generations to generations, grown in certain ways, produced in certain ways, and they're used for so many purposes, many cultural celebrations, such as, for instance, Jewish celebration of Sukkot, is related to food, and that food is at so many of these kinds of things. And we also use food to mark important events of our lives. There's the traditional wedding cake in Western weddings. There's other kinds of wedding foods, such as egg flours, sweet glutinous rice, etc. at Asian weddings. There's many different types of things. There's lavash presented at some Eastern European weddings. And these show how we as people connect to particular types of food as an important part of our heritage. And so what I'll talk about tonight is first, the threats that climate change can produce for these very traditional types of foods. And then I'll talk about some international law mechanisms that are designed around protecting this, but are inadequate to some extent. And then I'll conclude by talking about ways that these types of instruments and institutions in general can be reformed if our future generations of eaters and drinkers are to be able to celebrate the same foods and drinks that we are able to celebrate now. So let me move. Okay. This is not, oh, now I figured out how to move the slides. Okay, so let me give an overview. I'm going to first start talking about the importance of food and drink heritage. And some of this you'll know from your heart, right? You've had certain things around, like the little lamb-shaped butter things at Easter, or particular types of like Thanksgiving turkey. Many of these things are associated with particular events, particular celebrations, and just particular ways of life. So I'll talk about that in general. And then I'll talk about the effects of climate change on not only the availability of particular types of food, but also the quality of particular types of food. Because it turns out that climate change is going to affect food production in many ways beyond what one might think. For example, just the easy things like droughts or floods or temperature changes. There's lots of other subtle ways in which it can affect food. Then I'll talk, like I said, about our existing legal mechanisms for protecting these types of heritage foods. And it turns out we have some international mechanisms for doing so, but they're very, very inadequate given the scale of climate change threats posed to food today. And then I'll talk about some of the reforms that can be done in return. Before I talk about that, let me mention that this is not, some kind of far off sort of thing. Just recently, there was a report, and I think, want to say Scientific American, I'm not, no, it was in the National Geographic, about the Georgia peach. Very, very iconic food in America, right? And there are predictions that within 10 years, the Georgia peach supply will be threatened. Why is that? Because the Georgia peach, it turns out, needs to get below a certain amount of degrees every winter in order to trigger this dormancy process. Otherwise, the peach trees expend a lot of energy that it otherwise wouldn't, and actually wouldn't have the sufficient resources to blossom and grow peaches in the next upcoming year. And so there's a concern, right, that we're going to lose these very iconic foods of the American Southeast. And this is just one example. I'll go through a number of examples in the upcoming slides. But first, I just want to show why culinary heritage is important by giving some examples of things that are, some of them are iconic to people, some of them aren't, but still are, I think, helpful to understand in terms of understanding climate threats to this important aspect of our culinary heritage. This first one shows a picture of the preparation of Neapolitan pizza. And, just to sort of give a spoiler for future part of my talk, these foods that I will show you are all parts of the UN intangible cultural heritage protections. So these are all listed things. They're listed as food. So that's a spoiler for the upcoming part of my talk. But I wanted to show you these examples. And this is Neapolitan pizza. And what's protected by the UN is not just the actual pizza itself, the thing, but all of the process around it, the traditional mode of preparation, the firing of these ovens, all of that. Here's another example. And this example is the preparation of Nasima. And this is a food that is in Malawi. And it's a compound name for both the culinary and dietary experience of preparing this wheat-based fermented gruel. It's prepared in a group kind of setting. It's allowed to sort of ferment for a while. And there's a whole sort of, well, not wheat-based, sorry, maize-based gruel. And its process of preparation is a societal process. There's a whole extended connection where their way of life is related to this group preparation of this food, this communal eating of this food, and also the celebration of this food as sort of representing an approach towards both clean eating and avoidance of gluttony. The idea is this is a reminder of some of the earlier passages of time. And so many of restaurants feature this in their menus and is also listed as one of these UN intangible cultural heritage aspects. Other things, oops, I see that the microphone needs to be done. Okay, other things. So someone had mentioned beer. Belgian beer, turns out, is also listed as an intangible cultural heritage. Again, here's a whole production of it. And I made these slides so that you can see that it's not just the food itself at the end that is supposed to be protected, but actually the whole cultural aspect of it, from the creation, the sort of long, sort of sometimes wild fermented processes. All of these processes are part of the whole cultural aspect of food and drink. Other examples. This is the preparation of Georgian winemaking. By the way, winemaking differs from country to country. There's a whole handmade kind of urn element to Georgian winemaking that is protected in the UN intangible heritage listing. There's also a whole tasting kind of thing to ensure a certain type of taste and quality. All of this too, you can sort of see from these slides how there's an integrated part of this. And I'm just going to list a few more so you can see the varieties of food. This is more just Japanese Washoku, which is a whole social practice based on a set of skills for creating a number of small types of foods for sort of traditions of consumption of these maybe smaller dishes of food together. And it also is listed as a culinary heritage or a cultural heritage. And then the last few that I wanted to sort of list there's another one for Armenian lavash used at weddings. You can see the sort of both the production of lavash, this dry flatbread, and then also the use of it at weddings, right? So it's a sort of celebratory kind of matter. And again, these are foods that, again, are woven into various different cultures, including our own. Other examples, the creation of kimchi, the eating of kimchi, the sharing of kimchi. Another one less familiar to many of you, the Marula Fruit Festival of Namibia, where this fruit is pounded together, the juices are extracted, and they're fermented for a while. And then there's this cultural, ceremony where people share this together. Again, the range of these slides is to show you how foods, when I'm talking about protecting foods as part of our heritage, I'm not just talking about the availability of consumption itself, but also the process of production, the way that it is integrated into things that we celebrate as part of our culture, and then also the way in which it creates and sort of strengthens relationships between people. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of highlighting the importance of culinary heritage. Now, what are the threats that climate change poses for this? Well, many of these are the agricultural threats that you can envision, right? Climate change is likely to lead to, in some places, excessive precipitation, and that comes with a number of problems for many crops. Many crops can only grow with a certain amount of precipitation, and then flooding can harm the ability of the crops to produce whatever kind of fruits or vegetables you're trying to grow. It can also cause damage like rotting and other kinds of things, fungal growth. All of these kinds of things can be a risk posed to food from climate change. Droughts too is another possibility. And again, this depends on a lot of different weather patterns to explain why some areas might be struck by drought, other areas might be struck more by excess precipitation. And the reason why it's especially a threat to crops is because crops are usually adapted to certain areas, right? They're not likely to change in a sort of quick mitigation fashion the way that people might be able to, right? If a crop has been, usually an orchard crop that's been growing in the Pacific Northwest for a long period of time, it was adapted and bred for that type of climate. And with a rapid change in climate, such as that predicted by many climate change models, the existing crops that we have might not be able to adapt. There's other kinds of threats that are posed by climate change, including the presence of new pests and disease pressure. It turns out that the reason why certain types of pests are limited to certain regions are because they simply can't thrive in a different environment, in a different climate. The more that the climate changes and the more that certain types of temperature patterns exist, the more that these pests can spread to areas where the crops themselves haven't developed any vulnerability to those pests. And that's also important to recognize too. It's not the fact that pests are moving around, because you can imagine that pests moving from one area to another will be just fine if they leave this other earlier band, right? So say it moves northward in their migration due to the ability to move northward in climate change. What that means is they're going to be able to affect a whole different range of crops that might be even less adapted to those pests than before. So that's another concern posed by climate change. There's also flooding, just in general, right? That can drown crops, it can remove the topsoil, making the nutrient of the crops, the nutritional level of the crops much lower. It can also mean loss of natural resources, and it can also mean excessive heat. That is heat that is that both harms farm workers and can harm the crops themselves, right? Because again, like I said, many of these crops are tailored and bred over centuries for specific types of environments, so precipitation-wise, temperature-wise, and cannot necessarily survive if there's a rapid change in the environment. Let me expand upon this though, because it's not just about threatening the food supply. That's what many of these studies talk about and focus on, is the food supply that is affected by climate change. For example, no longer being able to grow rice in a certain area of Asia. However, there's another thing that is even more, I would say, relevant for culinary heritage. It can change the taste of the crops. Turns out that with many types of crops, for example, with the Georgia peach that I mentioned before, without that dormancy period that is triggered by a certain number of cold nights in the winter, without that dormancy period, the trees tend to have less resources, right? Because they've been expending more resources than they would have had they gone dormant. What that tends to mean, like I said, is production of fewer peaches, and the peaches that are produced, right, they have fewer sugars. They don't have that juicy sweetness that we imagine is a sort of typical Georgia peach. That's the case with many types of things, right? With respect to grapes, extremely sensitive to changes in climate, and I'll talk about wine a little bit. But what that means is that wine grown in a particular type of region, even with the same varietals, due to climate change, can taste quite different from what a regular drinker, say, of Bordeaux is used to. Same thing goes for beer, right? Hops, and just in general, many of the malts used in beer, they have a flavor that is associated with what's called terroir, right? The sort of soil that and environment in which it's grown. You can imagine that if the environment changes significantly, either due to flooding, where many of the nutrients are lost, or due to excess or under precipitation, you have dramatically different tastes, both in the malt and in the hops that go into beer making. And moreover, there are process-based kind of considerations, right? That go beyond agriculture. So in the production of many of these sort of cultural foods, like I showed you before, they are very low technology based, right? The idea is that this preserves communities' long-term creation of a particular type of food. And with, say, a very low technology type of food production, you don't have, right, all of these sort of temperature controls. You don't have the ability to sort of keep things at a certain kind of humidity. Belgian cave-aged wines, cave-aged beers, for example, they're stored in caves. And that depends on, they're stored in caves partly because they're cooler, partly because they have a certain kind of humidity level that helps for the beers to age. But what that means is that changes in climate can affect even the taste of many of these foods and drinks that we have certain expectations of over time. And so my talk focuses on future generations of eaters, because if we do think that the future generations, our future generations, should be able to share in certain types of enjoyments and pleasures, and indeed cultural celebrations that we have, then we should start thinking about how to protect these resources for the future. Now let's talk a little bit more about wine, because I wanted to bring this up so that you see an example of just one type of process of drink production in this case. Like I said, food production is also the same with many different kinds of things that you imagine as sort of cultural foods. For example, in Asian foods, fish sauce. There are now high-tech companies that create fish sauce in very controlled environments. Although traditionally they were fish left to dry in certain kinds of areas that were predicted to be less precipitation and reaching certain kind of temperatures. And then during the drying process, they get fermented and then they're placed in vats for further fermentation. That's the kind of thing where climate change can not just affect the availability of the fish, which it can because oceans are warming, but also the actual process of fermentation itself. The types of microbes that are necessary for a particular type of taste profile do not actually always match the changing environments that climate change poses. And the same thing goes with wine. Wine has a lot of aspects of its production process that can be affected by climate change. There's the crushing and pressing process, very important, especially for more traditional winemakers. If it's outdoor crushing kind of process, there's a danger of increased microbial contamination if climate change introduced microbes and other types of pests into the area that were previously not there. There can be temperature and humidity issues in terms of the pulping of the grapes. The fermentation process too, depending on if you're using traditional fermentation processes versus more high-tech temperature controlled processes, can be greatly affected by climate change. Same thing with the clarification process. So wine, you look through wine, it's clear. It doesn't have a lot of sedimentation. There's a lot of different types of traditional clarification processes for them. And some of them are not as effective in higher temperatures. They're dependent on particular temperature ranges. And so that too can affect this. And also the availability of some traditional clarifiers, the things used to clarify and clear up the sedimentation in the wine, that can be less available in light of climate change. And then aging and bottling processes. Again, those of you who drink wine know that temperature and humidity are very, very important in terms of the aging of wine. And to the extent that you're looking at a very, very traditional winemaker, and you want to preserve the ability of folks who are, long-term family-owned vineyards to keep producing things in a very traditional manner so that we have this as part of our history, our living history, then we might be concerned about climate change. And we might also be concerned about the availability of corn. That too is, an interesting sidebar on the production of wine. There are many sustainable wineries that are actually starting to use, I think it's a cornstarch-based product instead of the cork, because cork has been both over-harvested, but is also under threat due to climate change. And so there's a lot of stuff that we associate with just very traditional wines that are now not necessarily under threat, but under flux due to climate change. So let me now talk about other aspects that are maybe not so evident. So one is transportation. So to the extent that you have long transportation routes for the production of processes, that's affected by climate change. Some of the more modern processes are not so much. For example, when we're producing many, say, traditional commercial cake mixes in the United States, or anything that goes long distances from some grower to some processor to some facilities of combination. There's a lot of legal controls for safety in terms of that. But if you think of this in terms of more rural kind of economies or places with less developed modern food safety laws, you don't necessarily have to have that available. Imagine, right, a market in Vietnam, which is like a traditional kind of farmer's market. A lot of farmers wake up very, very early, bring their goods to the market to sell these goods. As the climate heats up, the ability of any kind of small microbial contamination to grow at a very, very quick rate increases. And so you have food safety issues involved with many traditional types of transportation routes that may not affect sort of industrialized countries nearly so much. But in more traditional economies, yes, it can be quite dangerous. Preservation too. Many preservation techniques, especially traditional preservation techniques, depend upon both certain kinds of precipitation and for certain types of climate in order to practice those preservation techniques. Moreover, some of those preservation techniques depend on the availability of certain types of goods to keep up with the preservation techniques. For example, the use of certain wood-fired stoves might be difficult to practice if those woods are also under threat from climate change. So it's quite a wide-ranging series of effects. So let me now talk a little bit about some cultural foods that are already being affected right now. So this is an example of berries that are used by the Wabanaki people in Maine and Canada. They're already seen as their supply being under threat. Oh, oops, did you have your hand up for? No, okay, sorry. Okay, they're already seen as their supply being under threat. And this was used not just for consumption purposes, but also to mark adolescent females entering into adulthood. And so these are used as an initiator to mark their entrance into adulthood. And due to climate change, these berries have not been thriving. And so that's one example of a food that is already being affected by climate change. Much closer to us is coffee. Coffee and chocolate, prized by many societies, are also threatened by climate change, as these crops are intolerant of having large ranges in temperatures and precipitation. They're used to having, they're only, many of them grow only at a very precise type of precipitation rate, also a very precise sort of temperature rate. And so you can imagine, yes, as temperatures change, we can move coffee plantations from coffee farms from one area to another. That can be done, but that's also a time-consuming and honestly very difficult kind of process. It's not like farmers can just sort of uproot their crops and move them elsewhere. These are often long-standing crops, and what that means is that the coffee crops that exist in a particular kind of geographical region may be under threat. And we might have to think of wide scale ways of addressing that. Coffee, chocolate, same kind of threat. And then the last thing is just a picture of a vineyard, also many of the threats that I mentioned before, with the availability of certain varietals to grow in a certain kind of area being threatened. And what that means, right, is that the taste of wine can dramatically change. And that's one thing that I'll talk about tonight, is how some wineries and wine laws are trying to address that. Because you can imagine this, right? Each variety of grape tastes a bit different. And as it's fermented into wine, that leads to the final product. But what it does too is, right, it's dependent not only on the actual variety of grapes, but where it's grown, right? That's the water. And what that means is you can't uproot the same variety of grape, place it in another region that has same growing season, precipitation that it once did in its earlier place, because that's going to lead to a different combination of grape taste and grape in the final wine product. And so I give all of these examples to show how climate change can affect not only the quantity of food available and types of foods available, but also the quality and taste expectations of those foods. What are our existing legal responses? Well, in terms of international mechanisms, we've got the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, which I mentioned before was where I drew all those earlier slides showing sort of intangible culinary heritages. We've also got the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And we've also got country level and private level responses, which I'll look to wine as just one example. There's a lot of other examples that are going on. So what is the UN Intangible Cultural Heritage Program? It's actually, a program that's under the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And it's through this convention, and convention is a treaty, for the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage that was adopted by the General Conference in 2003 and entered into force, meaning enough countries signed on to say, hey, we're going to agree to this convention. In the text of the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, it protects what are called intangible cultural heritage through a nominations process. It's not limited to food. So a number of things are listed as intangible cultural heritage. This includes things like traditional dances. It includes things like even sort of traditional folk singing. All of this stuff falls under that. And the reason why is that you might have heard about sort of UN cultural heritage sites. These are all sites before. Before the passage of this, the UN was focused mostly on protecting certain listed sites, right? Listed historical areas that we wanted as a globe to try to protect from any kind of danger, to try to keep, again, for future generations, to be able to recognize their history, enjoy this history, celebrate this history. In the early 2000s, the UN realized, well, look, that's not all there is to who we are as people, right? It's not just buildings, it's also foods, it's also songs, it's also languages, it's so many things. And so this was created to both have two different types of protections. One is what they call the representative list. That is a list of things that were considered so important, we needed to mark it off as something that is an intangible cultural heritage and something that we should have some protections for. And then there is the urgent safeguard list, one for which it's in danger or currently in threats. Now, no foods have been listed as that yet, although I would argue that the threats posed by climate change are affecting foods, some of these foods even now, to the degree where they should enter the urgent list. But there's a problem with the urgent list. And I'll explain that a little bit more later, but spoiler alert. The problem is that the kinds of threats that the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention was designed around was threats due to sort of loss of memory, right? That is, for example, with certain traditional folk songs, that not enough people from one generation was able to pass it on to another generation. And so it was focused more on providing educational resources rather than these more tangible kind of resources. Again, because, right, it's supposed to be intangible cultural heritage, while food has a bit of tangibility about it. And so it's kind of a different creature within this whole system. There are safeguards though. Like I said, if something gets listed, either as under urban protection or as just representative, then countries have to take necessary measures to ensure the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage present in its territory. Very vague. It's international law is often vague, and there's not really a specific mandate about it, but there's a sort of force of persuasion, right? Saying, hey, you have this international body that says you should try to protect this thing, means that there's at least this sort of a bit of international will built in. They also, at the international level, the convention provides for some degree of international cooperation. That is, other countries are not compelled, but are encouraged to work with a country that wants to protect a particular type of cultural heritage. And the most key thing is the program also creates funding for such a protection. Much of that so far has been related to both educational resources and then sometimes access resources. And I'll talk about some of the pros and cons of that too. Now, what are necessary measures? Like I said, it's fairly amorphous, but there are some types of features that the convention has. One is that, a country that gets the thing listed as either on the representative list or the urgent list, they have to actually do a survey. They have to identify where it's present in their territory, right? So take the traditional folk song. How many singers are there left? How is it being passed on? Take, say, Neapolitan pizzas. How many people are still producing traditional Neapolitan pizzas? How is the training encouraged, etc. And then they have to adopt appropriate policies. Again, very vague, but the idea is to get the country thinking at least about how to protect these things that even they've said should be listed. And then promotion of education. And this is where access to funding comes in, because UNESCO can provide some forms of funds for promotion of education. Again, the reason why it's geared like this is that the initial impulse to create this convention was concern about a certain loss of awareness about traditional types of cultural heritage, a loss of awareness from generation to generation, a loss of awareness in the general population. And so much of it is structured more around education than other aspects of preservation. And the difficult part of it is that food has that element, but it also has a bit of a tangible element to it, right? You can't just have the process of remembering how to grow a particular sort of grape, pulp it in a certain kind of way, ferment it in a certain kind of way. The knowledge is not enough to produce that wine. You actually have to have the grapes and growing conditions themselves. And that's why it's a bit of a weird fit with this program. It does provide for international cooperation, though, and that's where some of the sort of food protection can actually arise, right? There's studies, international studies can be conducted. It encourages that. It encourages countries to provide experts and practitioners. So with the Malawi Fruit Festival, people at ag extensions from different parts of the world can contribute to sort of finding ways to preserve the fruit. Training of all necessary staff, elaboration and standard setting, these are just available measures to each country. Creation and operation of infrastructures. If a country wanted to have some sort of yearly festival promoting a sort of dance, or a yearly festival promoting a certain kind of food and have some kind of governmental weight behind it, the convention allows for that and encourages that. Supply of equipment and know-how, right? To the extent that there's a sort of awareness loss in certain communities, there's the ability for state governments under the convention to provide that. And then there's also other financial aid and technical assistance, including where appropriate, the granting of low interest loans and donations. And that last part is the part that's been used more to the extent that the different foods are trying to adapt to climate change. But what are some of the weaknesses? It's a listing process. That is, there's not a more expansive process to protect all foods or drinks that are under threat by climate change that we consider to be sort of culturally necessary. Instead, it's it's up to each country to nominate specific foods or drinks or other kinds of practices and to say, hey, let's get this on the list. You can imagine the sort of perverse incentives this might create, right? If a country is actually contributing to the loss of a particular type of intangible cultural culinary heritage, for example, Georgia peach and US fossil fuels, that country is not necessarily going to want to get it listed, right? Even if it's contributing itself to that urgent threat posed to that kind of possibly representative food. I would argue that the Georgia peach is pretty representative, having grown up in the South. So that's one of the gaps now. The funding is insufficient for system-wide charges. It's really devoted to educational kind of resources, which is great if you're talking about preserving a language that is going to be lost in future generations, but not so great when it comes to large-scale growing sort of changes. And there's lack of consideration of ingredient quality versus quantity. That is, they're trying to do, to the extent that the listing concerns something, it's more so that people can go through the process of creating the foods, right, and having the celebrations, but not what the outcome is in terms of the food itself. That is, for example, if someone is enjoying Neapolitan pizza now, is it going to be the same as the ones that our future generations are going to taste? Or is it going to be different due to the different varieties of wheat that has to be grown? Is it going to have that less of that bite that Neapolitan pizza does? Are the tomatoes going to be less flavorful because we have to adapt the tomato harvest to be more resistant to certain kinds of pests, temperature changes, etc.? Is it still Neapolitan pizza if it doesn't taste like the Neapolitan pizza? Now, this is not part of the protection there. It's really just access to this. So what else is there? We've also got the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And this was a treaty that was designed basically to stop developed countries from stealing plant resources from other countries, less developed countries, and basically protecting them through patents. So basically, the idea was to protect them from biopiracy. So the objective was the conservation and sustainable use of all plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of their use, in harmony with the Convention on Biological Diversity for Sustainable Agriculture and Food Security. It's an open-ended language, although the initial driver was for protection of developing countries from bioprivacy, but it provides potential protection for foods from climate change. That is, it requires countries to survey and inventory their plant genetic resources for food and agriculture and threats to them. And this has been interpreted as including threats to these genetic resources due to climate change. It promotes the collection of them of those resources and information on threats to their use. Again, similar. This has been interpreted as requiring countries to evaluate the problems of using their plant genetic resources that are posed by climate change. So even though this is devoted towards concerns about biopiracy, it's been expanded in terms of interpretation. Promotion or support farmers and local communities' efforts to manage and conserve these plant genetic resources. Promote conservation of wild crop relatives and wild plants for food production, including protected areas by supporting the efforts of indigenous and local communities. All of that has been interpreted as more of an educational kind of effort. And so to the extent that, say, indigenous communities need to face threats to climate change, right? It provides some educational resources for this, but is not going to stem any underlying actual climate change. Cooperation to promote the development of efficient and sustainable systems of ex situ conservation of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. This is what's known as promotion of living seed banks. That is, instead of having seed banks where you just sort of freeze the seeds, you have seed banks where the seeds and plant genetic resources are being protected by being continually grown. And monitoring the maintenance and viability, degree of variation and genetic integrity of the plant genetic resources of food and agriculture. Again, very helpful for sort of preservation of a country's native species and also resources for protecting that those native species, but not necessarily adapted for the threat posed to them by global climate change. There are other tools that it allows countries to use. So countries can use agricultural policy measures, they can do research on conservation, they can promote plant breeding efforts, promote the expanded use of local or locally adapted crops, support a wide range of farm management tools, reviewing and adjusting breeding strategies. And many of these have been interpreted as creating a little bit of a responsibility on countries to start working on climate change mitigation and adaptation. That is, not mitigation, but adaptation. That is, you can imagine that from the perspective of climate change, right, all of these measures can be potentially adaptive measures, right, for traditional crops that are grown that are threatened by changes in climate, either in terms of their quality of production or their quantity of production. So what are their weaknesses? Their focus is mainly on providing access to the plant genetic resources, that is, just the genetic resources, not so much necessarily the taste of the plant, et cetera, despite potential intellectual property right claims. So again, it was designed really around protecting less developed countries from biopiracy from more developed countries. But to the extent that the treaty deals with climate change, it's really just about protecting adaptation research and enhancing adaptation research and sort of trying to at least enhance traditional agricultural products that are especially resilient to climate change impacts, versus the ability of the treaty to protect from plant genetic resources from the impact of climate change. That is, it doesn't have any tools to allow governments to have more persuasion over, say, having more renewable energy projects, having more carbon capture, having divesting from fossil fuels. None of that is really in the objectives of this treaty, and it's understandable why it's not, right? It's focused more on protection from biopiracy and to the extent that it can be leveraged towards protection of plants from climate change impacts, it's really focused on adaptation. So I'm going to sort of move towards sort of country level and private level responses. So I focus mostly on sort of the international kind of responses that seem to be available. On the country level response, and to do this, I have to give some background on how wines are related. I'm just going to use wine as an example. So you guys have all seen wine labels, Napa Valley, Bordeaux, all of that stuff. What does it mean? Well, the regional designation of wines have different legal requirements in different countries. So it's actually a very different regulatory system from, say, the US versus France. It's how we get stuff like Napa Valley wines in Bordeaux. But climate change affects the use of these labels by challenging growing choices and processes and consumer expectations in terms of taste. So just a background, in the US, alcohol is governed by a few different regimes. There's one, the federal statute, which allows for the establishment of American viticultural areas, so long as 85% of the grapes are grown in that kind of region. They also, but to get classified as a certain AVA, then they have to contain distinguishing features such as climate, geology, soils, and physical features. You can imagine, right, that climate change can be leading to some of these AVAs, designation of them, to change, right? Because it has this area, this mapped out area has to contain a certain kind of similarity in climate, geology, soils, physical features, and that range of climatic similarity might differentiate depending on the very regional changes of climate change. There's also trademarks. So there's certain different types of uses. So Napa Valley uses third-party certifiers. So they've formed an organization that is a third-party organization to allow certain things grown in that Napa Valley region to count as a Napa Valley winery. So that's a trademark kind of protection. And then there's also collective marks that are used by wine collectives. I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but my point is that the federal system is relatively amorphous. There's a bit of some protection around sort of mapping an AVA, but there's not so much in terms of delineating the specific kind of feature. That's more up to the third party groups where, in order to be a Napa Valley winery, it doesn't have to be only grown in Napa Valley, but it needs to meet certain kinds of standards. Because the idea is that they don't want anyone to dilute the name of Napa Valley wines. What this means for how climate change affects the wine label in the US is that because the regulations aren't related specifically to the use of particular varietals and winemaking processes, climate change doesn't affect the availability necessarily of those labels, right? So as long as it's grown in a particular AVA, it can have that AVA designation. As long as, say, the Napa Valley third-party certification says, sure, we will count you as that, climate change is not going to affect it. It's up to that organization to decide. But what that means in terms of how wine labels might be governed, and this is something that Napa Valley is tackling right now in light of climate change, is that, remember, part of the reason why we have these geographic labels is to give the consumer some taste expectation, right? Even though there's not a varietal expectation, that varietal is listed as, say, Napa Valley Chardonnay, the varietal goes there. But even though there's not that, there's a sort of quality that is represented by certain types of labels. And so they want to protect that, right? To have that sort of enhanced value on the market. And so what that means is that climate adaptation is more in the realm of what's known as private governance. That is, what happens now is that the Napa Valley collected third-party certification is brainstorming best practices for how growers who want to be able to use that certification mark can adapt their processes to ensure certain kinds of level of taste in light of climate change. And this can mean sort of promotion of certain kinds of watering technologies. It can mean a lot of things. And so it's all happening on the private end in terms of adaptation here. What's interesting is that France, it's much more federalized in the sense that their federal government has a whole quality mark through their, and I don't speak French, so I'm just going to say AOC designation. And they go further than our American viticultural areas. They go and they say, look, we have standards not only for what can be labeled, say, Bordeaux, in terms of geography, but also what varietals need to be used, what specific production processes need to be used, all of that. And that falls under an administrative code. Also, the wine samples must be submitted to a French agency to ensure consistency with what's expected of that region. Now, I talked about before how climate change can affect all of the processes of making wine. And what that means is that it's going to be hard, and it's already been hard, to ensure the same type of uniformity of taste in certain types of wines, right? Because if you can't, if say, type of varietal that is supposed to, by law, to be grown in order to access a certain label, doesn't thrive as well, that's going to change both the taste of it and the availability of it. If, say, certain kinds of processes can't really be used safely, that's also going to affect it. And so it's having a large effect on particular labels for wines. And so what you're seeing instead in France, like I mentioned in the US, the private labels are working it out themselves. They're working together to try to ensure some kind of best practices so they can adapt their wine and winemaking processes in light of the changing climate. What France is doing is they're actually lobbying the French government, right? The wineries are lobbying the French government so that they don't have as stringent requirements on the production processes, varietals, and everything, so that they can actually still reach the same type of taste while moving away from their traditional production practices and still call it, right, that same type of wine they've called it before. So what can we do better? And these are just some possibilities that I'm going to sort of end this talk with. The three things that I think are really important is creating a more expansive program for protection rather than merely listed resources. Creating programs that not only protect culinary resources themselves, but also promote access to those resources. And then also developing systemic responsibilities to minimize greenhouse gas emissions to protect those resources. So what would a more expansive program for protection rather than merely listed resources look like? Well, we can take as a model some different types of listing programs in the United States. For example, in our Superfund in our statute regarding sort of the disposal of waste, or RCRA, what happens is that there are two types of things. There's things that the EPA lists as having specific requirements, but then there's also what are called characteristic wastes, wastes that are toxic, wastes that are flammable, all of these things. And so companies are required to engage in certain labeling and reporting requirements if their things fall under either of those categories. We can take that similar kind of approach towards culinary heritage. We can take not only the ability to list specific things, but also to have characteristic resources. What kinds of things might be characteristic of a food that is necessary for protection? So we can list criteria to evaluate. Use of a broader range of stakeholders to engage with the listing process, right? Like I said, right now, it's really up to each country to self-nominate, and there's some perverse incentives built in for that. And so we could have more broader consultant with sort of different traditional communities, indigenous communities, et cetera. Creating, what can we do to create programs that can not only protect culinary resources themselves, but promote access to these resources? One thing is addressing supply chain access issues and strengthening those. I talked about transportation as part of this element, and a lot of this is going to have some kind of accessibility kind of issue, right? Like I mentioned with farmers markets and many of these sort of more traditional economies, they're not going to have sort of the strong refrigerated transportation market available here, which means that access is going to be threatened over time if any kind of transportation disruption or safety disruption comes in place because of climate change. Creating incentives and support for private actors to promote access to resources with culinary heritage. I think that's important too, to not simply rely upon the government, but also to promote a broad range of incentives for cooperation. And you see that already going on a little bit with US winemakers, right? They're doing this out of their own self-interest, but you can imagine that there's ways for governments to leverage that self-interest so that you can have more third-party actors involved. And then finally, creating systemic responsibilities to minimize greenhouse gas emissions to protect these resources. That's already been used in some of the actual place type protection sites. It hasn't been used at all in food and intangible cultural heritage, but some other cultural heritage sites, people have gotten extra sort of international attention due to listing particular sites as under threat because of climate change, and that has bolstered calls to reduce carbon emissions and sometimes actually generated more political action. One can imagine that this could work more. This could also work in the agricultural sector, especially because food and drink are so near and dear to us. And it might also increase support for the use of agriculture. We call carbon sequestration, which is again a way to reduce some of the carbon emissions coming from that are already around. So that's the other thing that I would suggest too. So with that, I'm finished with my talk. Wanted to end with a nice spread of food, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Questions?
Yes.
When you talk about the AVAs in the United States, are those reconsidered at any specific time period?
That's a good question. They have not been. There's a whole process. Oh, the question about the AVAs, have they ever been reconsidered? I did a search on this, and no, they have not ever been redesignated. There are people who speculate that in light of climate change, some of them might have to be redesignated simply because that area no longer really reflects that same consistency in climate, precipitation, et cetera. But that has not yet been done because we haven't really seen such a large scale shift, right? As in the recent decades.
What do you think the likelihood is that they will do it?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's going, the tricky part is that the people who are using those labels want to be able to keep using those labels, right? So they're going to fight any of that. And to the extent that anyone's going to want to change that region, it's going to be someone who's close by, who also has a winery and wants to be able to access that and say that they deserve to fall under the map of the AVA versus some other ones. And so I think it would be a tricky kind of legal fight, but the chances are that the chances will increase if there are sort of expanding neighboring wineries that are feeling left out of being able to use the AVAs. And I think that there's some pressure that's starting to go on there. Yes.
More of an international question, starting with the Versailles Treaty in the United States producing champagne. We recently acquiesced, but now Russia is producing their own champagne and not allowing Russia to import champagne from France.
Mhm.
So can you comment on the chaos of the legal aspects of your talk?
Oh, yeah, there's a,
International.
yeah. So the labeling, I mean, this is stepping outside of the climate change aspect, but just simply the labeling, there's a lot of what's known as sort of geographical labeling marks that are fought over intensely. And part of that, I mean, in terms of whether or not it's a mess, yes, it can be. There's a whole fight between, I think, Russia and I think Poland about who got to call certain types of things traditional vodka. And that was sort of, I think, they ended up both acquiescing in that perspective, because then, you know, that's expanded vodka, it's expanded everywhere. But there was a fight about that initially. There's a lot of different fights like that. And my sense of things is that that ends up getting more resolved by political will than anything else. There's not necessarily, well, part of it is just international law. We don't have any kind of actual international enforcement, right? To the extent that any of our countries in the world follow international law, it's because they think it looks good to follow international law. And so if they think that, you know, it's better for them to risk some kind of bad PR, but still get some kind of financial gain, that company is going to make that trade-off. And so a lot of these types of food labeling kind of issues end up getting resolved more, I think, in the political sphere and more in the sort of diplomatic sphere than actually in the legal sphere, although many countries do design their own labeling laws, sometimes infringing on other countries' labels, sometimes not. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was impressed that you mentioned the holiday of Sukkot. And I was
How what?
impressed that you, at the very beginning of your lecture, you mentioned the holiday of Sukkot. And I was wondering.
When I was writing about this, because I based this on a paper, it was because I was talking to a friend about like the Buddha's hand citron, and they were saying that they used it for Sukkot, and I was saying I just use it to make Buddha's hand flavored vodka. So that was where that came up, and I was like, oh, gotta work that in.
Oh, well, interesting. So I was wondering, using your argument about climate change, perhaps over these millennial period of years, could it be that with all the climate change that's been going on in the past, perhaps these ancient dishes aren't really that ancient?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, this is stepping outside the sort of focus of my talk, but there's actually a lot of they're food historians now. They're trying to recreate dishes and finding it difficult to maybe recreate the dishes that were even described to a large extent in sort of ancient recipes and things. Partly because sometimes those crops are no longer available, right? The varieties of, say, grapes that are used to make a particular sort of vinegar have by now been bred so differently that the initial one that was used in some Egyptian kind of recipes no longer even accessible. And so they have to sort of do all this sort of retro engineering to say, well, what kind of thing can we have access to now that can even remotely replicate what that tastes like then? So I think it's a really good question. And I'm not suggesting that anything can be preserved static in time forever. In fact, I don't actually think it should be, right? I think that, you know, for example, we have a lot of traditional foods that themselves have evolved over time, right? If you take sushi, sushi was initially not the fresh sushi that were available now, but it was actually a slightly fermented pressed kind of sushi. And over time with refrigeration, more access to sushi comes in the sort of fresh type, which everyone around the world kind of knows about right now, but it wasn't the traditional thing. I would say that both have a place in our culture. So I'm not suggesting any kind of static protection. I'm suggesting that we should think more about this and what each food means to us and what it means to preserve that as part of our culinary heritage. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Raj at home has a couple of questions on the Zoom chat.
Okay.
At least in the US, we are aiming for net zero emissions by 2050. Will this not restore the integrity of food production, such as for the Georgia peach and others grown in the US? and hence preserve the cultural heritage, question mark.
Yeah.
Goes on to say maybe other countries can follow the same example of US by self-financing with increased production and increased productivity. So it's got two folded in there.
Mhm. And I think that's a very good question. I mean, if we do all actually reduce carbon emissions, there won't be any threat from that perspective. There might be other threats, right? The continuance of growing particular types of foods, access to those types of foods, but there might not be that threat that's posed by climate change. That said, the commitments to reach certain targets are merely that commitment. So recent IPCC report has suggested that, or has shown that like none, I think there's only one country that is on target for reaching its Paris Agreement commitment. And so, so we'll have to see what happens with that. But I think that that is, this threat that's posed to food is yet another reason why it's extremely urgent that we try to reach these commitments, both as early as possible and as consistently as possible. And then what was the other question about financing?
Maybe other countries can follow the same example of the US by self-financing with increased production and increased productivity.
Yeah, and some countries are doing that. Again, none of the Paris Agreement countries are on target right now to reach these commitments, but they're trying to work with a lot of these mechanisms. And I think countries are working more and more as we realize the urgency of the threat in so many different areas other than food too.
Another one from Zoom. Some experts may say, there's an extra word in there. Some experts say have an export tax on critical food products exported to other countries, or through education on strategies to mitigate the effect of climate change on their food production. Or is it going to come to the burden falling on the US and Western countries to ensure other countries' cultural heritage and food production are protected? Or can it not come from the UN and its Division on Food Security?
Good question. Like I mentioned, the UNESCO creates a set of funds, so that does, and that's through all the countries paying funds to UNESCO, but that gets redistributed to many of these countries. So yes, there is a UN funding system for this. I should note that these intangible cultural heritage items are not all in only undeveloped countries, right? Underdeveloped countries. They are also in Western countries. So it's not just about sort of Western countries supporting other countries. It's about countries supporting each other. And there's a pretty wide range of countries with cultural resources that are listed. And that's why I included countries like Belgium and countries like Italy. Now I'm forgetting the other question. What was the other question?
I think you covered it.
Okay, thank you.
Has anybody sued anybody in like the International Court of Justice in The Hague? I don't know if that's even possible. Do you have any examples yet to match the children's suit about climate change in general, but with food, where people are actually going into litigation?
No, like I said, the only thing that's been into litigation are other aspects that are under UNESCO, which is for actual cultural heritage sites. And there have been lawsuits about that for failure to fully protect those sites in light of climate change. And that follows a similar kind of process. So by analogy, this should be available for food, although it hasn't been used. Yeah. Yes.
Could you talk about biodiversity and challenge of GMOs to small countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that Mexico has, I think, recently taken a pretty harsh stand on, which is that not only are GMOs threatening to biodiversity of food production in Mexico, but they're actually interfering with their cultural heritage. That is, their cultural heritage is having a large degree of varieties of maize, and both the licensing scheme of many GMOs and the possibility of cross-fertilization is going to threaten the traditional varieties of maize. So they, I think, I'm not sure if they fully banned it, but they've done a lot of large restrictions. So that is something that is a concern in many countries that often have a larger variety of types of agricultural products beyond that which is marketed under the sort of GMO label, or that are produced by countries or by companies creating GMO seeds. Does that answer your question?
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.